Welcome to lecture number 20. This is topic 2.9, Creating African American Culture. The first learning objective says to describe African American forms of self-expression in art, music, and language that combines influences from diverse African cultures with local sources. To start, the sources of African American creative expression include influences from African ancestors. Most enslaved people in the United States came from either West Africa or Central Africa, so many plantations retained a generalized West African heritage and identity. They practiced similar family structures, music, languages, cuisines, and folk literature. Community members on these plantations, such as conjurers or healers, were important for religious practices or healing common illnesses. Local European and indigenous cultures also mixed with these forms of African American creative expressions, as African Americans adopted the use of the English language and created pidgin languages which mixed their West African languages, words, and grammar structures with some English elements. Enslaved Africans and blacks in British North America retained some African aesthetic influences in pottery and quilt making. Colonaware, or handmade unglazed pottery, was found across the American South and originated in West Africa. Enslaved people utilized this pottery due to the high cost of finished goods in the colonies and had to provide for most of their needs making these pots. Others in the colonies practiced different forms of pottery, such as the potter named David Drake, sometimes referred to as David the Potter, who sold glazed pottery with rhyming couplets etched into the basins and pots he made. There was also a tradition of quilt making, used by African Americans as a medium for storytelling. Quilt maker Harriet Powers used quilts to tell Bible stories, local legends, and record astronomical events. These quilts were used for memory keeping to retain the aesthetic of West African art, traditions, and patterns. Quilts were also used in the Underground Railroad to convey messages and directions to escaping slaves. For musical instruments, many West African instruments made out of gourds were also made in North America. The dried gourd created a hard, hollow shell that could be made into rattles with a beaded net around it. This instrument, called the ahatse, was traditionally used in Ghana. Early versions of the banjo, which had origins in West Africa, were also made in the North American colonies. This was the gourd shell with an animal skin stretched over it and either animal fiber or other fibers used for the strings. The banjo entered the mainstream in the 19th century with the popularity of minstrel shows and later became more standardized into the banjo we're familiar with today. Drums, such as the djembe drum or a rope-tuned and skin-covered goblet drum, were also used. The djembe drum has been dated back to the Mali Empire of the 12th century. When African Americans arrived in North America, they had knowledge of African and European languages. Ladinos, for example, had spent time in the Iberian Peninsula and were sometimes fluent in Spanish and Portuguese before arriving in North America. Africans were also familiar with forming a lingua franca, or a language that's used to communicate with people from distant places, often for business. Those Africans who had participated in long-distance trade, whether on the East African coast or the trans-Saharan trade, were familiar with both Arabic and Swahili. This practice continued in the United States with the development of Creole languages. Gullah or Geechee combined in African words, grammatical elements, and English structure. Black English, a variety of English influenced by West African grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, also emerged during this period. Speakers of these languages are still around today, and the Gullah Geechee culture has been recognized as one unique and significant cultural heritage of the United States. The second learning objective says to describe ways enslaved African Americans adapted African musical elements from their ancestors and influenced the development of African American musical genres. Two distinct African American musical genres emerged from the African music traditions that started on plantations. The first is gospel, which blended Christian hymns and biblical themes with African rhythmic and performance elements. These elements include call and response, clapping, improvisation, syncopation of beats, and repetition of phrases in the songs. They were first performed in Pentecostal, holiness, or sanctified churches. Famous gospel songs include Stand By Me and I'll Overcome Someday, written by Charles Albert Tinley, seen on the right side of the screen. The second musical genre that emerged from plantation music with African origins was the blues. Originating in rural areas of the Deep South, the blues featured simple narrative rhymes and ballads, and it incorporated spirituals, work songs, field hollers, shouts, and chants. On the left side of the screen, you can see W.C. Handy, who's considered the father of the blues. The blues genre played a crucial role in the development of other American musical styles, such as jazz and rock and roll. There are parallels between the blues and other African musical elements. Senegambians and West Central Africans arrived in large numbers in Louisiana where the blues developed. The structure of the blues is also very similar to the Senegambian fodette. It utilizes a melodic and rhythmic pattern found in Senegambia, played on the kalam. It has a cyclic nature, which means it can be repeated as many times as a performer chooses. The pentatonic scale, common in West African music, is also a key characteristic of the blues. The influence of African musical traditions can be seen in the improvisation techniques also used in jazz, which will originate later in New Orleans. The last learning objective is to explain the multiple functions and significance of spirituals. Spirituals were often rooted in biblical stories blended with musical traditions from Africa. This musical tradition predates the blues and gospel music, usually describing the extreme hardships endured by African Americans who were enslaved. Originally, these were monophonic songs, meaning that there were only one voice, and the tempo could vary depending on the subject. Later, they incorporated the blending of voices and harmonization. The topics could be happy, hopeful, or sad, leading to the classification of songs as either sorrow songs or jubilee songs. Until the end of the Civil War, spirituals were passed down through an oral tradition, taught by elders to younger African Americans. It wasn't until after the Civil War that they were written down and published for mass consumption and preservation. In the late 19th century, the Fisk Jubilee Singers popularized this music style and toured across the country singing these spirituals. The Fisk Jubilee Singers were instrumental in bringing spirituals to a wider audience, performing for audiences including Queen Victoria of England. These songs served social, spiritual, and political purposes. Enslaved people used them to resist the dehumanizing conditions and injustices of enslavement. As field songs, they helped people cope with the conditions by expressing themselves. They could also express creativity by altering biblical hymns with new melodies and modifying the text. Additionally, spirituals were used to communicate strategic information, such as plans to run away, warnings of an enslaver approaching, and methods of escape from a plantation to the north. Often, the lyrics of spirituals had double meanings, communicating both Christian ideals and the hardships of being enslaved. For example, the common theme of crossing the River Jordan symbolized crossing into free territory in the north. It also symbolized freedom from sin and slavery. Spirituals use biblical themes of redemption and deliverance with popular stories from the book of Exodus about Moses freeing people from the Egyptians. They could also alert people to opportunities to run away via the Underground Railroad. Wade in the Water is a well-known spiritual that advised escaping slaves to travel along waterways to avoid capture. Spirituals are important because they reflect African American heritage and American identity. They capture both African origins and the history of the struggle in slavery, and the effort to collect and preserve these spirituals after the Civil War shows they are a worthy cultural contribution of African Americans. They preserved rhythm and performance styles from West Africa, such as the use of the pentatonic scales, syncopation, and African instruments. They also express contemporary experiences in America, leading to the evolution of the blues, which describe the struggles of the performer. The preservation of spirituals by institutions like the Library of Congress has helped to ensure their cultural significance is recognized and maintained. And finally, here's the recap. African American self-expression in art, music, and language combined African and local sources. Pottery, quilt making, and musical instruments construction created a new blended culture. Creole languages emerged, combining African words and grammar with English. African American music, like the blues and gospel, evolved from African musical practices. Spirituals combined African musical tradition and European religious hymns, serving as a forms of self-expression and communication. Spirituals reflect African American heritage and American identity. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.